Hey there! I invite you to follow along with my little experiment, using traditional lightweight quilling strips for my signature painting with paper method. This is the very first time I'm trying this idea after receiving so many questions about whether regular quilling strips can work instead of the heavy strips that I usually use. So come along and I'll share my experience and takeaways. A quick rundown of the materials I'm using. The background surface and a thick mound board. I've got a pair of scissors, a firm cocktail straw that I use to shape paper strips. You can use a rounded pencil instead. Tweezers, a variety of clips to hold the paper in position, and PVA glue. For the outlines, I use heavy paper. This is one application where I really can't go without it. I cut the strips myself from a 500 GSM piece of card. My children keep telling me to avoid saying sheet of paper, because apparently I can't pronounce it right no matter how hard I try. So I cut the piece of card into 5mm strips to match the width of the quilling strips I'll be using. I considered going for 3mm initially, but quickly realized that 5mm is about as narrow as my fingers can physically manage. I have a variety of warm-toned packs of traditional quilling paper here, and I've added a couple of greens into the mix. As always, the first stage of the painting with paper method is creating the outlines that will serve as guiding lines for the paper brush strokes, either to be attached to with clips or to create a confined area, essentially a border, that will later be filled with tightly folded strips. As I mentioned earlier, I have to use heavy paper for the outlines to ensure that each shaped strip segment can stand on its own. Something that can't really happen with the lightweight strips unless you roll them into one of the basic shapes. This was my life-changing discovery over 16 years ago, when I reinvented quilling without even knowing it existed, or that the technique I had just stumbled upon already had a name. It turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Because I knew nothing about traditional quilling, which in fact is quite an old craft that has been around for centuries, I began with a completely blank slate. I simply cut a piece of heavy card into strips and used them to outline the letters of my name, Julia. Basically the same process I'm using here to create the outline of the sleeve. The process is simple, but it requires precision and patience. First you shape the card to follow the exact curve of the pencil line, then test it in position and make adjustments, which are always needed. Even after 16 years of practice, I still take this stage slowly, making sure each strip is shaped and curved as closely as possible to the drawn line. It's also easier to work in smaller segments, because the longer the line, the harder it is to maintain the correct shape. The key to the outlining stage is the consistency of your glue. Working with thick PVA is so much easier than using it when it's runny. Thick PVA significantly reduces the time you need to hold a shaped segment in position. As you can see, it barely takes any time for the glue to start setting, and I can move on pretty quickly. You can achieve the right thick consistency by squeezing out a small puddle of glue and letting it sit for a while, sometimes quite a long time, depending on how runny your PVA is and how much you've poured out. Check on it every now and then to see when it reaches the thicker texture. This requires a bit of organization and planning ahead, but it makes the outlining stage much faster and far more enjoyable. When I move on to filling in the inner sections, any glue consistency will do just fine. I've also developed a habit of cutting or trimming paper strips away from the artwork. Initially, I used to cut them directly over the piece and then had to spend extra time removing all the little bits, and sometimes they'd even get stuck in the design if they landed on unset glue. So now, even if it's not always visible in the video, I cut everything away from the artwork. It's a simple but helpful habit that keeps the workspace clear and confines the offcuts to one area at the bottom. Things tend to get a bit messy towards the end of the creative process, so it's better to have organized chaos rather than pure chaos. When you dip a segment of shaped heavy paper into glue, make sure the entire bottom edge is covered. And also dip the end that will touch the strips already in place. The entire skeleton structure of the leaf needs to be as sturdy as possible. There isn't an exact order in which you need to attach each segment, but keep in mind that smaller pieces are harder to make stand upright on their own. It always helps if you can attach at least one end of a small segment to something that's already securely glued down. I'm speeding up the video footage a little bit, but for anyone curious about real time, the outlining stage took me around 12 minutes for this simple design, and allowed another 5 minutes for the glue to fully set. In the painting with paper method, it's important to move on to the brushstroke stage only when the outlines are completely dry. Otherwise, what could be a calm and meditative process turns into a constant struggle with papers shifting and not holding in place. In my own practice, I've noticed that if an element, especially a shaped paper strip, doesn't attach properly on the first attempt, the surface of the mount board can become oversaturated with glue and moisture. At that point, it's better to leave that area to dry completely and come back to it later to start again from scratch. It's nothing to stress about, just my personal experience that it pays off to work methodically and not force the process. If the glue needs more time to dry, it's best to let it do so. I often find myself talking a lot about glue in my lessons. I hope I don't tire anyone with my glue stories. But as you can see, this isn't an art form that allows for quick, impulsive expression, like energetically splashing paint onto a canvas. It requires patience and presence, and if one finds herself continuously thinking about glue, well, so be it. The outer line of the maple leaf can be a bit trickier to recreate because of its many twists and turns, but the inner lines representing the leaf veins are almost straight, so they can be done pretty quickly. Those veins divide the area into smaller segments, which are much easier to fill with folded strips than one large blank space. If you watched the previous apple tutorial, you might notice another key difference besides the type of paper used. The apple is basically a spherical shape that can't really be naturally broken down into smaller outline sections. It wouldn't look realistic if that's the goal. So for that design I had to start from the outer circle edge and move inward. And here with the leaf, the filling process will be easier because there is no need to curve the brush strokes or worry about how to position them more naturally. The inner lines representing veins already guide the direction of the brush strokes. You simply choose the one you want to follow when folding strips to fill in that segment. So this is where I am so far, a sturdy leaf skeleton so to speak, with the glue fully dry. Now I can move on to the main stage, which this whole experiment is about. One final glue note. For this stage, my puddle of glue is much runnier than it was for the outlining stage. For those who aren't familiar with my painting with paper method, the basic element of the technique is a tightly bent and folded strip of paper. I fold the strip multiple times, alternating the direction of each bend. If you let go at this stage, it forms a little zigzag shape. I usually press both ends together to make sure the folded bundle isn't too loose before dipping the bottom into the glue puddle. That usually applies to the heavier strips I normally use. When folding the lightweight paper, I can already tell that it doesn't need much pressure at the ends to stay tight. Because the paper is thinner, the folds come out quite sharp right from the start. Another crucial difference, which didn't come as a surprise, I was expecting it, is that I can't really fold a single strip of lightweight paper. It's far too thin to create a 3D brushstroke of the size I need, and more importantly, my hands can't handle that level of fiddliness. Folding 3 or 4 strips together already feels adventurous and challenging enough for my hands. I'm not used to paper strips behaving this way. Heavy paper strips always stay straight, whereas traditional quilling paper needs occasional adjustments to prevent the end from tangling with each other. There is definitely a learning curve with this paper switch. I can see that my first couple of brush strokes at the top of the leaf aren't as precise as I'm used to with heavy paper. They don't quite fill the available space. I'll go back to that area later to fill in the gaps if I want to. At the same time, I can feel myself adjusting and getting better at matching the space with every new paper brush stroke. I believe my main personal challenge comes more from the width of the quilling strips rather than their weight. When I created my first edge-glued piece Julia 16 years ago, I hand-cut my card into 7mm strips. I chose that number simply because I like the number 7. A few years later I moved on to 10mm strips, mostly because I was still cutting paper by hand and it was much easier to mark and cut 1cm strips rather than 7mm ones. Later I increased the width even further to 13mm, which I've been using for the past 10 years or so. It just feels right, comfortable, natural, and allows me to repeat the folding motion for hours without my hands getting tired. Right now though, I'm experiencing quite a bit of discomfort working with these 5mm strips. Long story short, for anyone wondering how wide the strips of paper need to be for the painting with paper technique to work, the answer is absolutely any width. The only real criteria is what feels comfortable for your hands. You'll know it by trying a few different sizes and settling on the one that feels most effortless. But despite the discomfort of working with 5mm strips, what I really love about this experiment is how beautifully the color blending works. When I talk about color mixing using 2 strips of heavy paper, I always point out that the effect is an optical illusion, explained by the limits of the human eye's ability to distinguish alternating color stripes. After a certain distance, the eye can no longer separate the colors and begins to perceive them as a single blended hue. Simply put, if you mix red and yellow paint, you'll get orange. Similarly, if you take a red strip of paper and fold it together with a yellow one, you'll get a tight little bundle that appears orange. What I'm noticing here, working with these lightweight paper strips, is that this optical illusion becomes even stronger. The blending effect is amplified significantly. The paper is so thin that in many cases I wouldn't even be able to tell that I used strips of different colors. I know I did, but the blend looks so smooth that it's almost deceiving. You can still see the texture, of course, it's always there, but the color blends are much more fine-tuned than with heavier paper. This opens up a broad range of possibilities for mixing colors, from how many strips to fold together to which specific color combinations to create from the paper I have available. My main approach to working with colors is to create subtle variations and smooth transitions from one color group to another. Here, if I separate all my strips into several main categories, I'd get orange tones, greens, reds, and a couple of pastels. When choosing which papers to use for a brushstroke, I first decide which main color group I want it to belong to. For example, if I want it to look predominantly orange, I'll start by selecting an orange strip. Then I'll reinforce it with another shade of orange, maybe one that leans more yellow or perhaps a salmon or terracotta tone. Because it's just a variation of the same main color, folding these 2 strips together will result in a brushstroke that still reads as orange overall. But I don't stop there, because as I mentioned earlier, traditional quilling paper is very thin. I like to fold at least 3 strips together. It not only adds more color variation, but also fills the space faster. So to the 2 oranges, I might add a pastel shade if I want to lighten the brush stroke, a red if I want to make it bolder and darker, or a green if I want to mute the brightness of the orange. I understand that color mixing might feel a bit challenging if you're used to traditional quilling techniques, where each basic shape you create is made from a single color. But color is one of the key elements that can elevate a simple creation into something more sophisticated and expressive. And truly all it takes is a bit of courage to play and experiment. Because no matter how well you know color theory, it all comes down to practice. In my opinion, the fastest and most effective way to learn color mixing is to try different combinations and observe the effects you get. Nothing substitutes for that hands-on experience. And trust me, after folding and mixing dozens of different combinations, you'll start to feel much more confident in your practical understanding of color work. You can also observe what I'm doing here with my strips, which colors I pick at the start of each brushstroke and how the folded brushstroke ends up looking once I've pressed them together into one tight pack. If you've watched my Apple tutorial, which I created using just 3 colors plus white, you already know that it's possible to achieve sophisticated color blending even with a very limited palette of paper strips. When working with lightweight paper, if you don't have a large variety of colors, it's actually easier to create subtle variations than with heavy paper, simply because you can mix 4 or more thin strips together in one brushstroke. For instance, if you only have one shade of green, but want to place a few slightly different brush strokes next to each other, you could fold together 3 greens and 1 blue for the first combination, then 3 greens and 1 yellow for another, and maybe add white for a lighter variation, and so on. I hope that makes sense from my description here, but if not, let me know in the comments and I'll think about how to make this clearer through a visual explanation. As you may have noticed, I chose not to narrate every single action I take while filling in the leaf interior. Instead, I wanted to share my overall experience of the process, one that's new to me in certain ways. And by the way, that's exactly how my art practice keeps evolving. I constantly make myself try new things, no matter how small, whether it's experimenting with a new type of paper or incorporating another papercraft technique. It doesn't matter if some experiments are less successful than others. Over time, you build a toolkit of little tricks and discoveries that ultimately keep your art feeling fresh, new, and ever-evolving. And that's so important for the longevity of any creative practice. This curiosity and openness to experimentation have kept me going for the last 16 years, and I'm still eager to continue exploring everything paper can do. I used to think there was a limit, that I'd get tired of paper art after a couple of years, but in truth there is no limit unless you decide there is. As I reach the end of this leaf piece, I already feel much more comfortable working with lightweight paper than when I started. I know that if I want to incorporate more of it in future designs, I'll probably use 1 cm ready-made strips, or simply cut the paper myself, the way I do with my heavier stock. In any case, I'm genuinely intrigued and very happy with the refined look that this lightweight paper allows me to achieve. This experiment definitely feels worthwhile, and I'm going to keep going with the same actions to fill in the rest of the leaf. I'm going to go ahead and finish the leaf with a very few inserts to fill the most noticeable gaps, especially at the top where I was still a bit cranky with my folding. I also want to add some color to the stem, because even though I inserted a bit of red paper inside, it still looks slightly disconnected from the rest of the leaf. I usually use brush markers for any last fine-tuning touches, so I'll add just a few gentle strokes to smooth out the red blend and bring a bit more color into the stem. That's basically it. The whole piece took me about 45 minutes, including both the outlining and the filling stages. I'm curious how this compares to working with traditional quilling elements. If any of you have created a similar project in size or complexity using your usual quilling technique, let me know in the comments how it compares time-wise. I'd really love to hear. All in all, I think this little leaf is a successful proof that traditional quilling paper can work beautifully for my painting with paper method. So no excuses, guys. If you're curious to try this yourself, just go for it. Whether your experience turns out to be a yes, a no, or a maybe, it's still a valuable part of your creative journey. If you enjoy this kind of art making and would like to dive deeper, feel free to check out my online course Painting with Paper Foundations. You'll find the link in the description. I'm keeping the course open for now to allow anyone who wants to learn from me to get full access and personal support, but it's not feasible for me to run it indefinitely, so if you're thinking about joining, don't wait for too long. Please like the video if you enjoyed watching. Thank you and happy creating!